let's turn now to coverage of the war in Vietnam. We've talked about it some. I mean, what would you say in general? How would you grade with, CBS's coverage of the war in Vietnam?
First rate. I mean, I absolutely, without apology, first rate. CBS, again, for reasons I don't know, got interested in Vietnam, basically because of the players we had working for us. A guy named Peter Kalischer, long dead, I'm sorry to say, and also one of the few guys who came from a wire service background. He worked for United Press for a long time, and Charles Collingwood, and we were the only television there when the monk burned himself in the square in Saigon, and Collingwood was there. Um, and I don't know, and I can't remember offhand why there was a particular reason. I think it was a particular reason for people like Kalischer and Collingwood were interested, and they carried us along in this interest in Vietnam long before important American military involvement began. And as it grew and grew, and as the Bureau grew, it fell to me, I was the one mostly who was involved in refining and editing, if you will, scripts as they came in. The scripts would come in via teletype, a machine that no longer exists, but teletype from Saigon, usually preceding the film by days. And I would go over it and either request changes or suggest changes or veto things because things I didn't like. And a matter of fact, on the Cam Ney thing, although Ernie Leiser and Fred Friendly were facing up to the Pentagon, I was the guy putting it together, making it ready for air, which is how I first actually met Safer, and subsequently Safer would turn to me when he was in Saigon as a touchstone and to deal with editorial matters and other matters, and we became very close personal friends as a result of that too. But not just Safer, but I was the main pathway because I was able to concentrate on a particular project, unlike Hewitt, who was off in 17 different directions and never seemed to be able to focus. I say this talking about one of my heroes, but seemed to be able to focus on a particular thing, or if he did focus on a particular, he'd make an offhand judgment one way or the other without relation to the guy at the other end of the judgment and how it should work. And so I was, in a sense, a softening of that, as well as taking prime responsibility, of making sure the particular story or project was in shape for air. And we had a pretty, I'd say, very good working relationship. I mean, Hewitt depended on my judgment and good sense. And, occasionally he'd have a better idea and override me. But mostly, that was that. So I was in charge of the Vietnam coverage, I'd say. On occasion, when a bigger project came along, it would fall to Russ Bensley. That is, when the film and the audio came, he'd have to put it together if it was some bigger story than just what had happened today or yesterday. And one day I started to tell you a story earlier about Salant came in one day and wanted to know who was vetting Eric Severite's scripts, for policy. And to his horror, discovered that nobody was. And suddenly a search went on to designate somebody to be Severite's editor. Mm-hmm. And of course, the logical person would have been a fellow named Bill Small, who was then bureau chief in Washington. But Bill Small, who I consider one of the most astute bureaucratic politicians of our age, somehow or other was able to sidestep it, and suddenly Salant designates me without being Severite's editor. And so
how did Severite respond to that?
Having
an editor, I mean...
He had no problem. Severite knew the rules probably better than I did, and Severite was not a guy who was going to jump the traces. He was not going to express a personal opinion. He was easy that way. But what happened is that Severide and I would have a discussion every day at which I would bring him up to date at some detail. He was always very curious about what was going on in terms of that night's broadcast. And from that, we'd make a joint decision, I think it's fair to say, about the subject of his essay.
And this would be what, in the afternoon?
Right,
We would
right.
write it that day?
Oh yeah, every day, that day. And he's a very fast writer, really. Once he, and he had his own researcher dedicated to him, various ladies who did research for him. And, but it got to be kind of a joke. I was spending more time talking to Severide than I did with my wife of the day back. And when I became Washington bureau chief, for reasons I've never been able to fathom, the job came with me. I mean, Bill Small was able to escape it when he was bureau chief, but I wasn't. And so in Washington, I'd go around, I'd sit down with Cronkite, and we'd be, it'd take an hour sometimes, and just talking about what was going on.
Yeah.
And as I said, I can't remember. He was really easy. He was very cognizant of his role and what he could and couldn't say. And I'm trying to remember if there was a time when a piece was killed by Bill Small. In the management upheaval I referred to earlier, I became Washington bureau chief after being vice president. Bill Small came to New York to take Gordon Manning's job as an Uber vice president, senior vice president, and almost a designated heir to Dick Salant as president of CBS News. That's another story I'll go into in a minute. And Severide did a piece about the dedication of the Hirshhorn Museum, which was a brand new building, part of the Smithsonian, an art museum in Washington. And he didn't like it. It was very out of style with the rest of the Smithsonian buildings. It's since become quite a landmark of its own, and I think in the art world it's quite recognized as an important building and an important collection. But it was brand new, and Severide didn't like it, and pretty much said so. But I thought we could get away with it. I mean, it wasn't, okay, Bill Small didn't think so. Now, I was amazed that Bill Small had even read it, because Bill Small most of the time didn't read Severide's scripts. But I'm pretty sure now that some mischievous person tipped Bill Small off to this. And I defended it. Small did not accept my defense, and he went to Severide and asked Severide to make changes, which Severide refused.
Mm-hmm.
I thought with good reason. And so Small killed the piece. Okay. Now, the wallpaper, as they say, a word I hate to this, is that Severide, over the years, had been pushing Bill Small onto Bill Paley as the ultimate next president of CBS News to replace Salant.
Mm-hmm.
Gordon Manning was thought to have the inside track, but Severide used to talk to Bill Paley, a heritage of their days together in World War II in England, and they would have, I don't think, very important conversations, but they were good friends on the phone. And Severide continually pushed Small as the man for tomorrow, the next president, resulting in Gordon Manning getting fired, Small going up to take Salant's place, and Severide being happy about this. And several months after this happened, Severide went to New York for some reason, and he came into my office and sat down, and he said, "You're not going to believe this." I said, "What am I not going to believe?" He said, "Small is the ruinization of CBS News." I said, "I can't believe it coming from you. What the hell's that on?" Well, he'd gone up there, and he'd been there for a couple of days, and he walked by, and he says to me, and Bill Small sits there with his two chief assistants, Sylvia Westerman and Don Richardson. I don't know his names. People he'd taken from Washington to New York with him. And they sit there and they're watching the evening news. They're not watching the. They're giggling. They're telling jokes. They're making joking remarks about it. Severide was aghast that his nominee, and turned on Small. Okay, in terms of killing Small's chances of being the next president of CBS News. Small was very, 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 very upset, to the point where when Severide retired, we knew this ahead of time, I think it was 75, although I'm not sure, it might have been 76, my memory is 75. On the budget cycle preceding this year, I put in, and my memory is $10,000 as of maybe 20,000, farewell party for Severide. I saw this as an important enough event in Washington. The president might show up, you know. I mean, Eric Severide stepping down, he was almost as famous as Walter Cronkite.
Yeah, right.
And Bill Small killed it, okay? Just killed the item. Said, I'm not going to give that son of a bitch a cent, okay? So I went down to the CBS corporate office, and I said to the CBS lobbyists and those people, and I said, you know, Severide's retiring next year, and, you know, we really can't do a party. We're not the party-giving business, you know, we can't do it. You know, you guys ought to do it. And, of course, they had limitless money. And, indeed, they grabbed the idea, again, thinking the president might come to something. And they took charge of the Severide party, which is how I finessed Small. Then, as we got close to the party, in September of that year, I get a call from Salant, who said, Sandy, you know, I've had very many unpleasant conversations with the chairman. And I said, yes, and the antipathy between them was well known. And he said, well, I've just had the most unpleasant conversation ever. I said, yes, so why are you calling me? He said, Mr. Paley had just found out by looking at his calendar in September that in November he was supposed to go to Washington to Eric Severide's retirement party. And he is not going to stand for this. Not going to stand for what? For Eric Severide retiring. And so he said, I told him this was his rule. Well, first of all, nothing was going to keep Severide from retiring. He was tired. He was wiped out. His pieces were really kind of not up to par. He was just doing it by rote. And he really wanted out. And Salant said, I told the chairman this. And then I said, and also, Mr. Paley, the 65 and out rule is your rule. Severide's 65. And Paley said, that's bullshit. What about Jack Benny? I thought that was wonderful. So Salant needed an avowal from me, or from Severide, or from Severide through me, that nothing, not $1 million could keep him at CBS News past retirement. Easy. I mean, I don't know if Severide called Paley separately, but I called Salant back and said, forget it. There's not enough money in the world to keep Severide at work. Okay, so that settled that. And Paley was coming down, wouldn't miss this thing for $1 million. But Small was not going to come down. I said, Bill, you're screwing yourself. If you don't come down, it's going to be the object for much discussion. I mean, there are damn few people who understand how you and Severide, don't like each other.
Right.
But this is going to blow it open. Washington's going to know that you didn't come to this thing. I mean, you can maybe come through and do a walkthrough, whatever. You've got, I mean, for your own sake, forget Severide or his feelings. His feelings won't be hurt. But for your own sake, your own professional sake, you've got to be at this thing. So he did come, and they never shook hands. They never had any kind of dialogue at all.
Yeah.
And of course, then there was another management upheaval, and Small was out.
We were talking about, we got to Severide via a discussion of the Vietnam War. was there any awareness of, let's say, in the news department, how close Frank Stanton was to Lyndon Johnson, and the fact that Johnson was complaining to Stanton
Yeah.
about war coverage?
Yes, we were well aware of it, and not only that, but before that, Blair Clark and Jack Kennedy were classmates at Harvard, and Jack Kennedy offered Blair Clark an ambassadorship to Tunisia, which Clark turned down at Mr. Paley's behest, because Mr. Paley thought it was much more important to have Blair, a friend of the Kennedys, at CBS News. So the interplay between CBS News and presidents we have known is a long story.
Now, did this influence, coverage of Vietnam, especially earlier on, before Cam Ney sort of opened things up? I'm thinking,
No,
for
the burning,
example,
the self-immolation of the monk. I mean, management watched it like everybody else. They didn't have any prior knowledge that I know of, even though the Pentagon was raising hell with Friendly and Lizer.
I mean, I know that the Bay of Tonkin incident, CBS did a very perfunctory coverage of that on the news,
Right.
and that's when Murrow called Friendly, Murrow in retirement now, angrily saying how, and Murrow had been in the government, he knew how to put things together, and he said, you blew this one, and CBS News blew this one. So there was.
But I don't believe that is, I've never heard that, and I accept it at face value. But I don't believe that there was government involvement in our perfunctory coverage of the Bay. I think it may have been the slovenliness, laziness.
But not self-censorship.
But not self-censorship,
Okay.
right. Because, I got all sorts of evidence against self-censorship. The burning of the monk, Cam Ney. And if I put my mind to it, I could come up with half a dozen of, the ear episode, which caused me a lot of personal grief, where Don Webster, a reporter in Vietnam with a cameraman named Smith, were out with some group of GIs, and there's the GI cutting the ear off a corpse. And you see this right on the piece. And we put it on the air. Now, before you upchuck, no, we didn't show you clinically the severing of the ear. We did wide shots, but you knew what was happening. I mean, there was no question of what this GI was doing. We didn't get in close to show you the blood and the gore pouring out. I was very queasy about things like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, the Pentagon raised bloody hell about this, and somehow, I don't know, got to Salant, and they were insisting that the GI and the helicopter in the back, they were Australians, they weren't Americans, and this is ridiculous, and you're maligning, blah, 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 blah. So I'm in charge of doing the post-mortem. That was another one of my functions back in those days, was doing post-mortems, more than I like to remember. And so I get involved, and Webster says, of course they were GIs. I mean, but Webster doesn't remember the name of the GI. He remembers the name of the unit, but there'll be at least 60 guys, and nobody's going to admit they cut the ear off, knowing that CBS News is interested in the story. So I spent, I can't tell you how many hours and how many thousands of dollars in the technology of the day, going in on that helicopter and going in on it, on the identification numbers and all, blowing it up. We couldn't get it so you could read it. We finally did, and I wouldn't even put a number on how much I spent on it. And of course, it's a GI helicopter, which satisfied the Pentagon that we had it right. So, no, there was no self-censorship, and that's one of the glaring examples of the fact that there wasn't.
Yeah. Now, speaking of the divisions in the country at the time, refresh our memory about CBS coverage of the '68 Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
Okay, that was the riot, as the post-mortem report. Governor Kerner of Illinois ran a committee that looked into it and called it a police riot, which it was, about anti-war demonstrators who gathered in Chicago. And strangely enough, the riots were downtown Chicago on the so-called Gold Coast, not at the convention, which was at the Stockyards, which was way the hell a suburb of Chicago, way inland. I mean, there was excitement in the convention, but not nearly the kind of riotous outburst that occurred. And again, this was film mostly, and so there was a time lag getting this stuff on the air. And unfortunately for Hubert Humphrey, the riotous film was available coincident with his acceptance speech, for which he's never forgiven us. When I say us, I mean the networks as a whole, not just CBS News.
Yeah.
Because as soon as we got it, we put it on the air. And it interfered with his acceptance speech. Now, but there's a funny incident, which I think you're referring to. Dan Rather gets into a melee with somebody on the floor. This follows Mayor Daley of Chicago, the father of the current mayor, not this Mayor Daley. Senator Ribicoff of Connecticut is making some speech that Mayor Daley didn't like, and Mayor Daley in his seat, shown on television coast to coast, is shouting some kind of swear words, which I'm sure if we could have heard, we could not have put on the air. But if you're a lip reader, well, we didn't even have to be a lip reader. You could tell what Daley was shouting. I can't remember if this followed or preceded Dan Rather getting into a fight with some security men on the floor, and Dan Rather shouting, "Don't touch me," and these guys "Don't push me," and it was quite a scene. And they eject Rather.
Did they punch him?
Well, he says they punched him. Okay, it's not obvious. I've looked at that stuff again. Talking about postmortem, I looked at that stuff over and over again, and I want to tell you a little secret. I think Dan threw the first punch. Okay, which is, you look at the tape, it's pretty obvious. And that brings me to another story I'll get to in a minute. Well, let me do it now. 1964, at the convention, John Chancellor on the floor, for some reason, is accosted by security, and in a very lighthearted way, and I can't remember what his transgression was, they pick him up and they carry him off the floor while he's giggling about it and saying, this is John Chancellor, being carried off the floor and it was quite a laughable thing at the time, but it was some serious thing that preceded it. Come 1968, suddenly there's Dan Rather involved in a similar incident, which always made me kind of suspicious, okay? Anyway, Cronkite's watching this and shouts out something like, "Bunch of thugs here," really lost his cool for the moment.
This is on the air? Or
on the air.
Right.
He's in the anchor booth looking at his monitors, or he could have looked right out and seen it in person. And I forget his exact words, "a bunch of thugs," and he went on somewhat, attacking the security in the hall, although the real rioting, as I said, was happening downtown. Okay, again, I don't know the channel because I'm sitting right next to Cronkite. I was Cronkite's anchor producer, if you will, and my position was literally right next to him, in touch with the control room and in touch with Hewitt, with Hewitt kind of guiding the boat, if you will. I mean, this is like an aircraft carrier. It takes 5 miles to change course. I don't know the channel because I'm out of it, but somehow or other, the word gets to the control room, which is right outside our booth, and Mayor Daley has heard about Cronkite and is just so gone there and wants time on the air. And CBS, again, I was out of the whole mix. I wish Salant was still alive. Somehow CBS agreed, and Cronkite agreed, to interview the mayor in the booth the next night. Okay. And they're given, I don't know, I'm making it up, 7 p.m. Okay, could have been 6 p.m., could have been 8 p.m. The mayor's going to come to the booth, and he's going to take my seat and be interviewed. Well, the mayor gets to the booth 15 minutes early, okay, and he barrels through with his security. He's not taking no for an answer. Bursts open the door to the anchor booth, comes in, and motions me to get out of my seat, which I do. And he comes around, he sits down, and there he is, and Cronkite's totally off his feed, and conducts what Cronkite himself describes the most embarrassing moment, professional moment of his life, interviewing Mayor Daley in a very abject, apologetic way, for which to this day Cronkite is upset and unhappy about.
Mm-hmm. But of course, that's interesting. It's a well-known episode. Would you say that in general, for all Walter Cronkite's great strengths, I mean, he was not, let's say, a great interviewer in the sense that, let's say, a Mike Wallace or Dan Rather could be when, in terms of going after the jugular, if there was a hard-hitting interview, he would draw people out. He would draw Dwight Eisenhower out. He would, but there was some kind of failure of nerve, or I don't know how you would explain what happened with Daley, but maybe there was a larger issue that was just not his forte. Doing the tough interview.
Let's talk about Daley, then I'll get to the tough interview. The Daley thing, I think, was an aberration in every way. I mean, and I take Cronkite's self-analysis, that he was just thrown off, and he wasn't prepared, and he blew it. He blew it. He will tell you that in his own way. Yeah. He did blow it. About being, he was a different kind of interviewer than Mike Wallace, there's no question about it. About not going for the jugular, well, the answer to that, like a lot of questions, is yes and no. I mean, he did ask Frank Sinatra what he knew was a very important, touchy question about the mafia. Okay, he didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't try to make it go down easy. If you look at the transcript and you look at it, so I think it's a mixed bag with Cronkite. As a whole, he was not the hard charger that Mike Wallace was. There's no question about it. But I think you have to judge his interviews in an individual way, is what I think is a fair way to put it.
Were you involved at all with the coverage of the moon landing?
Oh yeah.
What can you say briefly about your role in that and how CBS covered that event?
Well, again, I think very well, because Cronkite was so enthusiastic about it, and he had Wally Schirra as the way we were configured. Cronkite was in a studio on 57th Street. Schirra was at his side. I, again, in charge of that part of the operation, was underneath. The actual anchor desk and apparatus was up 6 or 8 or 10 feet high, and me and a couple of other people operated from a hole underneath. And my memory is that the landing occurred at like 2 a.m. New York time, and Cronkite had been preparing for this for years, and he was speechless, literally speechless at the time. Now, he's been accused of affecting that thing, and maybe he did. I don't know. You'd have to be in his skull to know. But he took his glasses off and he wiped his hands and he sighed, and he didn't cry, but it looked like he was on the verge of some important emotional outburst. Can I do a funny sidelight on that?
Of course.
I knew Gloria Steinem a long time before she became famous, and she'd gone to a Vienna Youth Festival, and I interviewed her about, she was with the American delegation. We found out years later it was a CIA operation that she was part of, which she has owned up to now.
Right.
Anyway, I knew her before she was famous and glamorous, okay? Gordon Manning knew I knew her. And Gordon Manning came rushing around to me. He said, we got nobody on this thing, that says this is bullshit, that this is terrible, going to the moon. We got all these problems on Earth. He said, we got to get somebody on here who's going to say, this is nonsense. He said, call Gloria Steinem. This is like 1 or 2 in the morning. Call Gloria Steinem. And let's get her in here. And she can tell us, what nonsense is it. This is one of Gordon's virtues, by the way, having this kind of insight. And so reluctantly, I call Gloria Steinem, and to my surprise, she's up, and I lay out, well, she says, first of all, she's on deadline for Clay Felker doing a piece for New York Magazine, or maybe it was Esquire, I'm not sure. And she just couldn't, that's where she was up, she's working on this piece, and she couldn't tell us. And secondly, she was certainly not going to go on television unless she had a hairdresser, okay? So I go and I report to Manning, Manning says, call Felker, let's get her off that. And he says, get Hinda, this lady I referred to, the milkshake,
Right.
Hinda Glass said, get a hairdresser in here right now. I call Felker, and wake on, I explain it, and he says, sure, just tell her forget the deadline. I can ride with that. Getting her on television is more important to me, than. And so I call her back, and and Felker says, forget the deadline, and we've got a hairdresser, 2 o'clock in the morning, and we send a limousine to pick her up and bring her in. Somebody else, at Gordon's behest, had got Kurt Vonnegut to come in. Mm-hmm. And so there we had a panel of Kurt Vonnegut and Gloria Steinem telling us how there were so many more important problems on Earth, and what are we doing going to the moon?
During this period, the competition with Huntley Brinkley, how important was that?
Very important. Let me put it this way. Very important to management. Although, again, we were shielded from this. One day, and I'm showing how we shield. One day, Dick Salant walked into the Evening News Complex, and as you walked into our newsroom, there were 2 big bulletin boards on either side of this narrow corridor, and he looks up, and somebody has posted, this is on a Tuesday morning, has posted a memo with last week's news ratings on it. And in a rage, which he was capable of, he rips it off, crumples it up, comes to me and says, I want you to gather everybody on the evening news staff that's in the building. I want to see them right now, okay? So I go hunting up people, and a room full of people, and he gives us a lecture about the ratings, which are none of our business. And don't you forget it. I don't want people talking about the ratings. I don't want you concerned about the ratings. Your job is to put on the best damn news show you know how to do it. Other people are worried about the ratings and are concerned about the ratings, and it's none of your business. I mean, okay, it was really tough talk. Yeah. And so that was the attitude, okay? And I think when I joined CBS in '56, I think you'd have been fired if you started talking about ratings. Yeah. And of course, in those days, we didn't have access to the ratings. They became mechanized and easily available later on. But there's no question that over at BlackRock, they were concerned. And there was talk, I am convinced, leading up to '68 or '69, of replacing Cronkite. After all, Paley caused Cronkite to be fired from the conventions in '64, right. Because it not only was an artistic disaster, which everybody, but it was a ratings disaster. Right. Huntley Brinkley was so much. Right. So, I think it was '68, it might have been '69, Huntley retires from the Evening News, and we, effete Eastern establishment types, as Mr. Agnew called us, always thought that Brinkley was the attraction of the Huntley-Brinkley group, because Brinkley was the wisecracking, right. sarcastic, nasty guy. But we found out that when Huntley retired, that he was basically the attraction for the Evening News, not Brinkley.
Yeah.
We were all shocked at that. Also, my son, who's in the business in an academic way, tells me, and he's done some research on this, that during the after strike of 1964 was it? I forget, the after strike where the newsmen went out on strike, and Cronkite was on the picket line, and Huntley was on the picket line, but Brinkley stayed at work. Uh, my son, as I said, has done some research on this, says that's where the crack first appeared in the Huntley-Brinkley invincible ratings, was that when Brinkley stayed at work and Huntley was on the picket line, people stopped thinking of them as a pair, as buddies,
Right.
as pals. But when Huntley retired, that's when Cronkite became supreme in the ratings. And so yes, there was always awareness of the ratings.
Can you generalize in any way about the difference in the two broadcasts?
Well, yeah, yeah, that's easy. They had Brinkley, we had Severide, okay, for starters,
Right.
okay.
But also in the way in which hard news was covered.
Well, I don't think there was much difference. I really don't. They didn't. Huntley carried the bulk of the news over there, and Brinkley was kind of a junior player in terms of the ratio of news coverage, and Brinkley concentrated on the stories that lent themselves to his approach, which was being a smart aleck, a very good,
Right.
good smart aleck, and so that was his virtue. In Severide we had a craggy, very good-looking, dominant personality who was talking from Mount Olympus, who'd been more experienced, who'd been around, who knew more than you did about what was going on, and he was going to tell you some of the stuff that you didn't know about what was going on. That, I think, basically the major difference between the two. Huntley and Cronkite, when you try to analyze them and separate them, were very much of a pair. Both Midwesterners, although Huntley did most of his early career in the West Coast, but fancied himself kind of a rancher, yeah. So I think that was the major difference. I think we were more hungry about scoops than they were. But there wasn't much to choose, I don't think, if you did a content analysis between the two shows.
All right, let's turn now to your move to the Washington Bureau of CBS.
Right.
When and how did that come about?
Well, it came about as about of a bigger upheaval. Gordon Manning was fired. Bill Small was appointed his successor, and it designated, if you will, successor to Salant down the road. I might explain how Severide got involved in that one. And he wanted to bring his own people to New York with him. And the question of who's going to replace him occurred. And to people like Jack Schneider, who was then a very important corporate executive, who told me later, there didn't seem to be any question. I was the guy to go to Washington. Washington, you've got to understand, unlike today, was a really important job within within all the news bureaus. You had Nixon as president, and all of the turmoil that created, and coming off Lyndon Johnson as president, which was even more tumultuous in a sense than the Nixon presidency. And so I was the obvious. Jack Schneider said I was the obvious choice. It also gave me. I got another promotion, another raise in pay, and maybe a change in titles, although I don't remember that, to entice me. But it didn't take much enticement. And secondly, I didn't want to work for Bill Small, who was the antithesis, and I think I reflect the thing of what had gone before at CBS News up in New York. Bill Small used to boast that one of the first things he did when he took over was he eliminated coffee machines in all the bureaus worldwide and saved CBS, by virtue of doing that, something like $80,000 a year. Okay, something that would not have occurred to any previous occupant of that chair. And it was shocking. I used to get calls in Washington. Well, I got a call from Don Webster, then working in Hong Kong, calling me in Washington, complaining, said, doesn't Small understand that by taking out the coffee machine, the CBS bureau was in a high rise in downtown Hong Kong. People were going to leave in mid-morning, take this long elevator ride. They're going to have to go across this big boulevard to get coffee and maybe bring it back, but maybe drink it there. Come back.
Yeah.
Now we were going to lose the bureau, for a certain amount of time. I said, Don, I'm not in that business. I'm out of it. There's not a damn thing I can do about it. But it was that sort of thing. Now also, Bill Small was the proximate cause of Cronkite stepping down when he did, in the sense that there was a terrific 737. Is that the big double-decker plane that Boeing builds? The 737? No, that's 737. The huge one.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, but
737 or 747.
747. Yeah. Okay.
We're rolling.
Okay, so two 747s ran into each other on Tenerife and the Canary Islands, kind of way out of reach for individual coverage. Peter Kalischer, CBS News bureau chief in Paris, wanted to charter a plane to fly to Tenerife. NBC and ABC had already had their own charters and were en route, so we were half a step behind. The foreign editor of CBS News of the day, a fellow named Sid Fetters, an acolyte of Bill Small's, said he couldn't, on his own hook, do this. Small could not be found. I mean, now this is another aspect of Bill Small. I mean, the president of CBS News, under Dick Delancey, Mickelson, was never out of touch, never, no matter where they were or what they were doing, and no matter how cumbersome the technology was. Bill Small could not be reached. Okay, so CBS News singularly had no individual coverage of this monstrous air disaster, a really huge air disaster in Tenerife. And Small says Fetters could have done it. He doesn't understand why Fetters didn't do it, okay? This set Cronkite, really upset Cronkite. And when Salant was still president and Bill Small was vice president ready to move up, Cronkite went to Salant. No matter what you hear or read elsewhere, I was almost a participant in this, and told Salant that he wanted to retire as undefeated champion, and he was afraid of the way CBS News was going under Bill Small, the coffee machines, Tenerife, a couple of other episodes such as that. Salant pleaded with him, begged with him, not to do it on Salant. Salant was nearing retirement. Salant says, I want my successor to make that decision. Please don't do it. Cronkite agreed, okay? Bill Leonard then, in another management upheaval, Bill Small lost his job. Bill Leonard became president pro tem of CBS News. First day he was in office, Salant was in on him and saying, Bill, I love you, I respect you, I think you're terrific. I think the damage that Bill Small has done to CBS is such that we can't recover. I want out of here. I want to get out of here while I'm number one, and CBS News is number one. And I don't think the situation is retrievable. I'm paraphrasing, of course. Okay, and I'm privy to all of these discussions, and then months go by and nothing happens. Nothing. And I said to Leonard one day, we're talking about this, and I said, by the way, what the hell's going on with Cronkite? How come I haven't heard any more talk about Cronkite? What did you do? And Leonard goes, I don't know if you can see it on camera, okay, and nothing's heard from. Finally, Cronkite asserts himself forcefully, and Leonard is hooked with the responsibility to pick his successor. Exceeds the Cronkite's wanting to retire, and Leonard's first choice to replace Cronkite. And again, I don't know if it's in Leonard's book or not. It's been so long since I read that book, which I didn't think was really very revealing. Have you read Leonard's book?
A long time ago, I've looked at it.
Yes. Anyway, Leonard's first choice to replace Cronkite would be a dual anchor, which was the fashion du jour, of Roger Mudd and Charlie Kuralt. Now, Roger Mudd had every reason to believe that he was the designated successor to Cronkite because he was the main fill-in. After Reasoner left CBS News to go to ABC News, Roger Mudd became Cronkite's alter ego, if you will, when Cronkite wasn't available. So Leonard said, how about you, Mudd and Kuralt? And Mudd was agreeable, thought it was a great idea. Kuralt ran screaming from the room, I'm told. Not for $1 million, because at the time we didn't know about Kuralt's second family out west, you know, whereof I speak, and his whole other life. And Kuralt had the real dream job of getting lost and not being found till he was ready to go on air. And it was a dream. He's got a bus, the CBS News bus, and the last thing in the world, he had understood what a taskmaster being the evening news anchor was. It's really tough, hard work. And you're tied to New York, okay? So he withdrew. So Leonard's second choice was a dual anchor of Mudd and Rather. And Mudd said, in effect, I'm out of here. I quit. I mean, I'm not going to have anything to do with that guy. I leave it to you in the Mudd book to figure out what that's all about. But Mudd left CBS, and for 18 months, CBS paid Mudd to keep him off anybody else's air. He was never seen on air again. And so there's Rather, who's being seduced by Roone Arledge at ABC. Rather's contract, coincidentally, is coming up, the end's in sight. And Arledge is making a pass at Rather, promising him all sorts of things. I always felt, without a scintilla of proof, that Roone was playing a game to put it, that he didn't really want Rather, but he wanted to raise the ante such that Rather would cost CBS a hell of a lot of money. And in that he succeeded, if that was his game. Anyway, so Leonard is negotiating with Rather and Rather's agent, a fellow named Dick Liebner. And they set on a deal, a 4-year deal, which is so rich that nobody except Paley can approve it. And so as Leonard tells the story, again, I don't remember how he does it in the book, but I remember him telling it to me in person. Leonard, a guy named Gene Jankowski, who was Leonard's immediate boss at the time, go to a meeting with Paley and, I can't remember the guy's name. Paley's number 2 at the time, Frank Stanton's replacement, a retired Air Force general who Paley had a lot of trust in. Oh, God, okay. Well, the 4 of them are in a room at which Leonard presents the Rather situation, and not just the money part of it, but the other aspects of it. And this other guy, whose name escapes me for the moment, isn't that terrible, according to Leonard, goes through the roof, absolutely didn't like Rather at all, and screamed and yelled, according to Leonard, that, my God, we're paying Rather more money than some of our divisions make. Now you got to understand, this is a time when CBS was a conglomerate. It owned the biggest magazine publishing company in the world. It owned Holt, Reinhardt, Winston, a book publishing company. It owned the record company. I mean, it owned the toy company. It owned the Yankees, the New York Yankees. I mean, so for this guy to say we're paying Rather more than some of our divisions make was no idle, hyperbole. And according to Leonard, Jankowski sat there mute, which Leonard never forgave him for because he expected some support from Jankowski. And finally, Mr. Paley said, according to Leonard, some of the most expensive things I've paid for, some of the cheapest things I've paid for have turned out to be the most expensive. And some of the most expensive things I've paid for have turned out to be the cheapest. He said, we'll go with the Rather deal. And that's how Rather became Cronkite's successor.
Yeah, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but in a sense, isn't Roger Mudd more Cronkite-esque, if I can use that term, than Rather in a way, in terms of his style, the gravitas, the straightforwardness, if you will.
Yes, the answer is yes. Okay, yes. Uh, why Leonard didn't back down from a rather mud thing, I don't know. I suspect, again, I'm making this up, that Leonard was afraid of the public relations consequences of losing Rather, who was, by any standard, a major star in the business. And it would have soiled Leonard's reputation to lose Rather. That's as good a theory as I can come up with to face those facts. But you're right, mud was more in the style, and as I said, for years now, mud had been replacing Cronkite on the air, not Rather. So by every indication, every outward indication, mud should have been the successor. And I don't know how else to explain it. Also, mud is not prone to those personal peccadillos, if you will, that Rather is, about getting attacked on Park Avenue. What's the frequency, Dan?
Right.
And the cab driver kidnapping him on the highway in from the airport in Chicago. And also getting mussed up at the convention in '68 in Chicago.
Let's continue with talking about your period at the Washington Bureau, where you retained your vice president title, you executive editor. Can you just say something about that experience, something about how the Washington Bureau worked when you arrived, what changes, if any, you made, and what it was like in that period of the Nixon administration?
Okay, well, to get to the changes I made, the one most dramatic change in my mind, which will seem like minor league baseball to you, was something so simple and dumb it hadn't been done, and that is, I insisted, and it took a lot of, I broke a lot of backs in the Bureau doing it. I insisted that when at presidential news conferences particularly, but any other news conference important enough to be broadcast live, we were to ID the questioners, that is, identify the questioners with superintendent positions. And we drilled, my deputy at the time, Bill Headline, we drilled and drilled and drilled till we were sure we got it down, with several designated spotters who would tell the control room who the questioner was. So we had to have experts on facial recognition of the Washington bureaus. And we drilled and drilled and drilled until we were sure we had it. And we did it without telling anybody in New York we were going to do it at a presidential news conference. We just did it. Every question that got up was identified by organization as well as name. And Small called me kind of peevish, okay, which indicated me we'd struck a home run. He thought it was unnecessary and it took a lot of effort we could have used elsewhere. And in a very mild way, kind of chewed me out, but didn't retreat from doing it again, and the other networks followed on. So I consider that we manufactured a major change in operation, because when I would sit and watch those news conferences, it would bother me not knowing who was asking the questions. Okay, the Nixon White House was remarkable, and the Washington Bureau. My first day in the office, I go sit down in what had been Small's office, and on the desk, clean of everything, are two telephones. There's a conventional phone of the day. This is way before cell phones, you understand, that sort of thing, which has 4 or 5 buttons at the bottom. It's got, forget if it has a ring dial or buttons. It may have had buttons, but the bottom's got a hold button and other extensions that I can punch in. A conventional phone. Next to it is a red phone with no dial, no identifying marks except that it's red, okay? Nothing. And I call Marge, my assistant. I said, Marge, come in here. What is this red phone? Oh, she said, that's the conference phone. I said, conference phone? She says, yeah. You pick that up and it rings on Ron Ziegler's desk. Ron Ziegler is the press secretary of President Nixon. No intervening secretary, no nothing. Right to Ziegler. It's also connected to the two other bureau chiefs, NBC and ABC. And anytime you guys have something of mutual discourse, you pick it up. And if they're not there, they don't answer. And that's that. I was jolted. I had never known about this, never heard about it. And given my seniority and my position in New York, I'm quite sure Gordon Manning didn't know about this. Somehow he would have told me, well, certainly not Salant. And this little game is being played by these four guys in Washington.
Now, what was the purpose of it? So that Ron Ziegler could talk to
Right.
them, or
No.
call them easily, or the other way around, or both?
Mostly Ziegler. Because television was so important to the Nixon White House. People don't think of Nixon that way, but it was, or at least to the people around him, that Ziegler would call, for instance, if he wanted to designate a pool, that some operation would be a pool, that is, the networks would have one camera and would share. Or if we would have a logistic problem with something, we could call Ziegler to get it worked out. But I was so shook up by this, and I'm not a lawyer, but I thought antitrust, the three networks colluding. A very good friend of mine, boyhood friend of mine, was a prominent Washington lawyer, coincidentally, and I called him up. I said, David, I got to have lunch with you, and I got to have a little quick seminar. And I explained this to him. And he said to me, it was a very simple rule. He said, as long as you don't exclude, if the White House designates a pool, that's okay. That one camera services everybody.
Right.
But if you guys decide something's going to be a pool, or there's only room for you three, or only room for one of you that you're going to share, you cannot exclude anybody else from that. Otherwise, you're going to go to jail.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's what you got to do. You can't say no to a station from Spokane, Washington, that wants part of your coverage, unless the White House has said this is a pool, and even then they're entitled to the output of the pool. So that was my indoctrination. And indeed, the press at the White House knew about this circuitry and were very annoyed and very upset about it, because they felt, and it was true, that information was being passed in this channel that they were entitled to and that they should know, especially about foreign trips, which were much more complicated and much more difficult in those days than they are today. And indeed, we would get heads up about presidential plans and about things that the press wouldn't get, or would get much later. And so there was a great deal of antagonism towards us media types, or us television types.
Right.
But there it was. So that was one very important aspect of it. I didn't realize how tied into the White House we were. And this system went through the Carter administration, where I stayed in Washington, and the first year and a half of the Reagan. Was it Reagan or Bush? Who followed Carter? It was Reagan.
Right.
And of course, Reagan people were terrifically television savvy, and so that phone was.
Right. I mean, how intimidating was it, at the Agnew speech, famous speech, criticizing the networks?
Well, the Agnew speech, that was the effete Eastern establishment, right. Quite the contrary, it galvanized us. See, I think it really did backfire. When Nixon took office, I was not yet bureau chief, but I remember Severide telling a group of us that, and this was confirmed later in several memoirs, that they thought, the Nixon people thought they had a year to 18-month honeymoon with the press, and then it was over, and that they had to get the press first. And the Agnew was the shot out of the cannon to get the press first. And it happened about a year into the Nixon presidency, okay? Well, what happened was it backfired, and in my estimation, and led by Cronkite. You're talking earlier about Cronkite not being ferocious. Cronkite led the charge and insisted on going to St. Joseph, Missouri, where he was born, and gathering a town meeting and giving a lecture about freedom of the press and how important it is, and that the White House ought to just mind their own business, which happened, and CBS put it on the air live. Again, I'm paraphrasing Cronkite's speech, but what Cronkite was the driving force behind that exercise.